friends, and thank you for joining us on Charting the Way Forward, where we deliver research-informed strategy and intelligence from across the Democratic coalition. This podcast is produced by Way to Win. I'm your host, Kerry Eleveld, and today I'm joined by
Tory, Gavito, co-founder and president of Way to Win.
Jenifer Fernandez, Ancona, co-founder and chief strategy officer of Way to Win.
And today we have a very special guest, one of our early adopters and now friend of the pod, Terrance Woodbury, president and founding partner of public opinion research firm HIT Strategies. He specializes in analyzing Black voters, voters of color, young voters who have typically formed a central part of the Democratic coalition. So welcome, Terrance.
Thank you so much for having me back again.
All right. Friend of the pod. We got a friend of the pod. Honestly, we haven't used that. I don't think we've used that yet. Have we used it? I don't think so.
I am the inaugural friend of the pod.
Yes. I'm good with it. I love it. All right. So Terrance is here for several reasons. I mean, one being that, of course, he's one of our favorite guests, as you can tell, but also he's been doing a lot of research on what happened with Black voters in 2024. So the last time we had Terrance on, we were all sort of still feeling our way through what really happened, why it happened, and whatever. We got a lot of research to draw on now, and Terrance does too. So Terrance, why don't you give our listeners a brief overview of what you found in your post-election analysis, specifically related to Black voters and what happened in the 2024 election? And then we'll delve more deeply into some of that.
Absolutely. So the last time I was here, we were relying pretty heavily on exit polls, which are notoriously which are varied in accuracy, especially when you start to look at subgroups, where his strategies focuses on this emerging electorate of young people and young people of color and men of color. When we started looking at some of those subgroups in the exit polls, there was drastic variance from exit poll to exit poll. Since then, we have voter files have been updated. Catalyst has released its What Happened report, which is often accepted as one of the definitive data sets, and now we have a much better idea of what actually happened. In a top line, Democrats lost ground with everybody everywhere. But more specifically, we eroded. We saw this continuation of erosion in the Democratic base, which we've seen since 2012, where every group of voters that we would consider our base voters, Black voters, Latino voters, API voters, young voters, urban voters, women voters, working class voters, we did worse with. But notably, we did not just do worse from 2020 to 2024. We have done worse with every one of those groups in every single election since 2012. And so I just want to combat this narrative that she was too woman, or he was too old, or headwinds were too strong. All of those are far too lazy of analysis to explain why we would erode with every single group across every single election, why we are eroding in 85% of Black counties and 95% of Latino counties in the last 3 elections. This is not the fault of a single candidate, of a single decision, or of a single input. This is cycle over cycle erosion that we got to get a lot more serious about analyzing.
Yeah, I love that.
Just
honestly,
people at home, just repeat that one more time. How many percent of Black in the districts and Latino? Say it one more time.
85% of Black counties shifted towards Trump every time Trump has been on the ballot, and 95% of Hispanic counties shifted toward Trump every time he's been on the ballot.
Right. Wow. So of course, that's one of the things we have talked about, in our analysis is people who didn't show up and how that changes the electorate. But the erosion you're talking about over, a decade plus now is very serious. And that's one of the best, clearest summations. It's kind of painful to hear it of it wasn't just Harris. It wasn't just that she was a woman. It wasn't just any one of these things. So
wait, Terrance, Yeah, is that shift we see toward Trump a reflection of partially people shifting toward him and partially people shifting out, like just
Yes.
deciding to stay home? So that shift represents both factors.
Yes, it is both. In the two groups where we saw the biggest shift amongst Black voters and API voters, we also saw the highest drop off in performance.
Right.
Right. And so the voters, less of our Black and API voters showed up, and some of our Black and API and Latino voters voted for Trump. So
Yeah.
both things are happening. And, one thing that we try to do at Hit Strategies is look beyond just the percentages and calculate raw vote count. Right. And so when we look at something like a 8% erosion amongst Black voters over the past 4 cycles, that's 1.5 fewer Black votes. When you look
1.5
at
million or
1.5 million fewer Black votes for Democrats.
wow. Okay.
And the same is true for Latino voters. But if there's just one group that I do want to just point to, zoom in on a little bit, and that is young men of color, who I believe are really emerging as the new swing voters that are determining the outcome of elections. Because while across all of these groups, we saw 5 or 6 point drop across all of these groups from 2020 to 2024, amongst young Black men, we saw a 19-point drop.
Oh, wow.
Amongst young Latino voters, a 24-point drop. Closing these gaps, these generational and gender gaps with young men of color are enough to change the outcome of elections in the Electoral College, in the House, and in the U.S. Senate. These are the swing voters.
Okay, the swing voters of today and tomorrow, and we have to get them to the polls. Absolutely. I tell you what. Okay, so let's cut to the chase. Obviously, you found a lot of flaws that in the Democratic approach to reaching Black voters, reaching Latinos. What do you think? This is a big question. If you can just answer this, this is something I like to do. Ask a big question. And if you could just do it in 3 words. No.
How do we win? You got 3 words. Go.
3 words. What do you think Democrats are getting most wrong in the effort to reach out to these voters? I mean, this is a whopper of a question, but let's not beat around the bush here, right? Let's just cut to the chase. I mean, if you could give here's a different way of asking that question. If you could give Democrats one piece of advice, or maybe 2 or 3, I'm happy to go with 2 or 3. What would it be?
Ooh. So one, we cannot take our base for granted, right? Just because they are base voters does not mean that they're always going to be with us. The biggest, there are several things that are contributing to why Republicans are doing better and better with young voters of color and with men of color. There's several factors I'm happy to talk through, but the one single biggest factor is that they are spending money trying, and they were not prior. So when I say do not take our voters for granted, you all know how this works. When we start cutting turfs and mail plans and targeting, we often, and I know the audience, you know what I mean? I know I'm talking to a bunch of operatives that don't mind nerding out with me a little bit.
Yeah, nerd out.
We are cutting these targeting turfs. We often omit partisan scores from 70 to 100. And that means that they are, between 70% and 100% likely to support Democrats. Right. Well, Republicans are spending millions of dollars targeting our 70 to 100 voters, our most likely Democratic voters, including young people of color and men of color. And the example that I'll give for anyone that's watching this, I would encourage or listening, I would encourage you to go on YouTube and listen to a show like Breakfast Club or Roland Martin. Every single ad that is played on those shows today in the off cycle is going to be a Trump ad.
Yeah.
Today.
Yeah. I just got through all of the NBA finals and all that. I just went through an entire NBA season, and the direct path from watching a ball game to listening to Stephen A. Smith is real direct. It's not even, it used to be like your kid would go on YouTube and, 30 minutes later they'd fall down a bunny hole. No. It's a direct path now to right-wing propaganda.
That's
Yeah.
right. So they are communicating with our voters year round, on cycle, off cycle, and then we come in the last 90 days and spend a whole lot of money on TV that they are not watching and think that we are going to persuade them. And that is just not the information ecosystem that we live in anymore.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead, sorry.
Well, I do wonder, do you think most of the voters, the men of color you're talking about, this huge drop off, do they fall into this group of people that you often talk about as rightfully cynical? Do most of those voters, can you just elaborate on rightfully cynical and what that means? We use the term sometimes, but I think it could benefit our listeners to fill out a vision of what a rightfully cynical voter is.
Absolutely. So, at Hit Strategy, we have developed a segmentation of the Black electorate to understand that voters are not a monolith. Black voters are not a monolith. We've basically identified 5 groups of Black voters. But the 2 that I believe are determining the outcome of elections make up about half of the Black electorate, and they are they are next-gen optimists and they're rightful cynics. What's fascinating is that both of these groups participate in one or less of the last 3 elections. They are very infrequent voters. They look the exact same by demographics. They're all Black, they're all men and women, and they're all millennial and Gen Z, and they have the same voting patterns. What makes them uniquely different is that the next-gen optimists thinks that they voted in every election. They want to vote in every election. They say they vote in every election, and they have voted in one or less of the last 3. They really just forgot. Now, the rightfully cynical voter, we call them rightfully cynical because they're closest to the pain, lowest per capita income, lowest home ownership, lowest graduation rates. They didn't forget. They don't think voting matters. They don't believe that their vote has the power to make a difference. And they don't like either party. They have been failed by systems, all of the systems. They don't like politics. They don't like churches. They don't like banks. They don't like vaccines. Like that cynical voter has lost faith in all of the systems that have failed them. And that is who Donald Trump is talking to when he says, what the hell do you have to lose? He's talking to a cynical voter that has lost faith in Democrats, doesn't really like Republicans either, but will vote for the guy that's offering to blow up the systems that have failed them.
Yeah, that's actually a perfect segue to what I wanted to come back and ask you about, Terrance, because I've heard you talk about how, policy is not a message and that there's a narrative and a story that needs to be told. So you talked before about what Dems are getting wrong, and it's very tactical, which, of course, we totally agree with. But there's also a substance issue, right? And there's a sense that the voters that we're talking about, who we lost, are in pain. Like they're struggling. We know that from all the listening we've done with voters. But only one side is giving people a kind of a narrative or a story about why they have that pain. How did they get there? Why are things hard? Why do their lives suck, like we like to say?
Yep.
And the other side didn't, because all they peppered them with was a bunch of policies that kind of washed away in the thick of the cycle. So I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about that part of your analysis as well. And that I'm assuming you feel like that's also one of the reasons why, one of the things we've kind of got wrong in 24 that we need to get right going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to make their lives better, but we also have to have a message about how we made their lives better. And it's got to be in that order. Folks keep asking what's the message for these cynical voters. I'm like, well, first we have to improve their lives. And passing policy doesn't always do that. A young man told me in a focus group, passing policy in Washington is only a win for voters in Washington. I'm sorry, it's only a win for politicians in Washington. Getting to 50+1 votes is just a win for the politicians. It's not a win for him until he's able to access those benefits, right? And so if we cannot, when voters are in pain and working twice as hard and getting half as far and following the rules and not getting ahead and feeling like not only have their lives gotten worse, but they will continue to get worse, and even more startling, they expect it to be even worse for the next generation. That is not just pain and despair. That is, those are folks that are resigning to this is just my reality.
Yeah, I
And
know.
they need to give that a reason. Why is there this much pain? And Donald Trump has come along and offered, the zero-sum politics reason, that the reason you have less is because the person that has less than you still has too much, that those queer kids or those trans workers or those immigrant workers, that all of those people that don't deserve it are getting things that you don't, that you should have. And in fact, the two examples of this I think are most prominent from the campaign were the trans ad, and Donald Trump talking about immigrants taking Black jobs. And when you look at the data, in fact, 59% of Black voters believe that the gains of the LGBTQ community have come at the expense of the Black community. 64% of Black voters believe the same thing about the advances of the Hispanic community. Notable there, those are not anti-immigrant or anti-trans sentiments. Those are, my community doesn't have enough.
Right.
And there's got to be a reason. And he's telling me it's because those folks have too much. And the only reason that we ever really offered was Donald Trump. All of your pain is because of Donald Trump. The racism is because of Donald Trump, the sexism, the inequality, the wage gap. And it's just, they just weren't buying it because all of those things existed before Donald Trump.
I mean, I don't buy it. Do you buy it? I mean, why would we why would we say something we don't believe ourselves, It's like he's a symptom, not a cause.
That's right.
So what have you found in the data then about the villain that could be a reason for the pain that resonates with Black voters?
Absolutely. So if we are saying that, the reason for your pain is not the voters, is not because of people that have less than you, then I think the alternative to that Democrats can own, and that 73% of Americans already agree with, and that is the reason for your pain. The reason you don't have enough is because the people that have too much want to take from you so that they can have even more.
Yeah, I love that.
Right. 73% of voters believe, all voters, not Democrats, not Black voters, 73% of all Americans believe that that greedy corporations and billionaires have rigged the system to keep themselves rich. And so we can own that narrative and give a reason for the pain, but we also have to present a vision of the world. If we solve that problem, what does the world look like? And then we can get to policies. And very important, there's a diagram on this in the slides. Even after the policy, we have to offer a plan to achieve the policy. Remember those cynical voters. They don't believe our promises or our policies. And the one thing that we did do very successfully during the 2024 campaign, all of us, is raise the name idea of Project 2025 to 100%.
Yeah.
Everybody in America knows what it is, right? But they also know that Republicans have a plan and Democrats don't.
Right.
That's what we got to solve for now. That's the long-term
problem. I tell you what, in our focus groups with Black men, and these were skippers, these were Black male skippers who had voted for Biden in 2020, but then sat out 2024. We definitely heard these sort of tropes that Trump had trotted out about, about trans folks and immigrants taking your jobs and stuff like that. They were not pro-Trump. They were repeating some of these Republican talking points, right? Here's a little bit of an offbeat question. One thing we asked them toward the end was about politicians they had seen or were interested in. And Bernie Sanders came up, and I don't think it was quite all of the men, but most of them by far had either seen him or were excited about his message or whatever, even as they were like, yeah, he's old. Like they knew he was old, right? But they were interested in Bernie Sanders. So what is Bernie? What's the Bernie juice? And can we give it to other people to drink?
Yeah. I'm so glad. Right, exactly. I'm so glad you bring that up because we've been asking similar questions in focus. It was one of the questions I ask in every group since the election is, who's fighting for you? And the first answer that I get from Democrats is nobody. Universally, in every room, everywhere, nobody is fighting for me. But when I probe and say, but if you had to give me a name, right? There are three names that come up, in varying degrees in every room: Bernie Sanders, AOC, and Jasmine Crockett. And you know, and one thing that those three politicians have in common is outrage, right? They're angry about what's happening, and they're expressing that righteous indignation, that righteous outrage. But the other thing, this is why, you know, there's a Bernie Trump voter, you know, a voter that voted for Bernie Sanders and then voted for Donald Trump, that just confuses the hell out of Washington. You know, like we just cannot. And it's really not that confusing to me, because again, it's the cynic. It is the voter that have been failed by systems. It's the voters that have that do not trust a policy without a plan, and it's the voters that, you know, that don't mind blowing up some systems that have failed them. And that's what Bernie and Trump were both offering, is to blow up failing systems.
You know what's interesting about those three is that I don't know about Bernie, but Jasmine Crockett and AOC are obviously pretty masterful at using, you know, the new ways of communicating. They're pretty masterful with social media and digital, you know, influence and the reach, right? Because we have two problems we're talking about. We got a message that isn't working, but we also have reach that isn't working, right? I don't know how good Bernie is at the reach, but his message sure is getting through. Like, is he a master? Jen, maybe you know, is he a master of social media and I didn't know it? Or is he just like been saying the same thing for 15, 20 years and that's it? There it is.
It's like 40 years.
40.
It's like,
For
it's
40
like
years.
consistency.
And somehow it's the thing people repeat, right? When you're out on the street, you hear it. You hear regular people say it. You hear operatives say it. You hear organizers say it. Everyone says, you know, I don't know that I agree with him, but he's been saying the same thing for years. And so, boy, do I trust him. There's just something about him that's gotten away with that. I think, like, I don't know. I think if you were to hear me say the same words over and over again for 40 years, we might be like, that girl's a little crazy. She needs to get off. She sounds like a broken record.
I wish the president of our organization had new ideas. No, I'm just kidding.
No.
Sorry, Tory, go ahead. You're making a point.
Yeah, no, that's the point. I just think he's got some kind of, I think he's truly been on the soapbox long enough that people are like, he really believes what he's saying. And boy, has it born to be true. You know, it's like he was Cassandra when everybody else wanted to be Pollyanna. And here we are, you know, what is it, Jen? What is it, like $80 trillion have been siphoned from the bottom 99% to the top 1% in the last 50 years or something. And we can all feel it. Like, we can all feel it. Who feels at ease about how they're paying for their kids' college coming out?
That's right.
Does anybody? Who feels at ease about, like, their parents becoming of an age where we've got to take care of them? Like,
Right.
Everybody has a question about their own economic futures. And yeah, like, it's unless you're Jeff Bezos and you can rent out Venice, I don't know, man. That feels like pretty extreme.
Yeah. I mean, look, Bernie Sanders represents an authenticity. Even for, again, the cynical voter is so disengaged that they certainly are not ideological, right?
Right.
They certainly are not, you know, have a bingo card of issues and picking who most aligned. That's not what's happening here. But there is an authenticity to saying the same thing for 40 years, to saying it before anybody was listening, right? And to being outraged about the conditions of it. Is outrageous that my generation is certain that the next generation will be even worse off than we are, that we don't even think about starting families because we can't afford to, that buying a house isn't even something we're pursuing, that it is outrageous that I've paid off. I took a $45,000 loan. I paid $60,000 and I owe $70,000.
Yeah.
That is
Crazy.
outrageous.
So many people are in that same situation.
I'm curious, Terrance, like, just listening to you, honestly, I just kind of want to flip over the whole table. I get really frustrated at the whole system. I was just on a call. What would be the thing people would be like, she's been saying that for 40 years. The thing would be about, like, focus on the South, right? Like, we got to focus on the South. And for a long time, it was like a sort of aspirational goal. But I got to tell y'all, by 2032, there's no winning the White House without it. So, like, take it seriously now, or we're locked out for another generation. And I was on a call with a different group. I won't call them out because everybody's like, bless our hearts, we're all trying. And we're not going to C3 way our problem out of this. This is the thing. Like most of the donors I talk to about the South are willing to give a $C3 to the effort. And just for our listeners, that's a nonpartisan, tax deductible donation. But like, how are we supposed to make a full-throated argument for what a Democrat is, what they stand for, what we want, like what we want Democrats to be, why we're going to vote for Democrats in a region where, like, someone was telling me the director of the Democratic Party in Oklahoma is a part-time volunteer.
Yeah, that makes
so
sense.
Like, we're going to just throw some C3 at that problem and act like it's going to happen. So anyway, but that's one thing I want to like toss the table on. The second thing I want to talk, the way money moves. Second thing I want to toss the table on is this projection we put on, presidents and Congress and all this, when like the things our people need to fix quick are sometimes just like these local elections where there's a power of the purse, but it's so unsexy and it's really hard to get attention to this stuff. So there's also sort of an imbalance of where we put our time and attention about what's going to help fix things for people quickest.
Yeah.
And then the third thing I want to flip over the table on is the mainstream media paying so much attention because they're like centered in New York. I learned this concept this weekend that there was this language that didn't have a word for mind. They had a word for perceive that meant see and horizon. And it feels like that's what we perceive, right? Like that feels interesting because it's like how we perceive is through these little eyeballs and then on the horizon. That's how I feel about the New York Times. Like they can only see what they can perceive in their backyard. And so this is a big tease up. This is a long way to get around to. Everybody's watching what's happening in New York City. And there's an interesting race right now. We got establishment candidate in Cuomo. We've got upstart candidate in Mamdani. And today's election day. Is that right?
Yeah, we're recording on election day.
By the time our listeners hear this, they will know the outcome, or at least we think they'll know the outcome.
It will be over.
Maybe not.
It may take longer to count. We don't know.
For another, curveball, the reason why they may not know the outcome, well, we could explain that as well.
Yeah.
All right. Before we go to New York, I do have to respond to the South because I am obsessed.
Go for it.
I'm obsessed with the South. I believe that the South got next. I believe that next is now. When you look at that 2030 census, we're about to lose nearly a dozen seats from blue states like California, New York, Massachusetts, and all of them are moving to the South. Like places like Texas and Florida and Mississippi. And I mean, I keep reminding folks we're going to spend about $1 billion to try to get Hakeem Jeffries 3 seats next year. And they're about to draw 12 of them in the South 3 years later. So let's just start getting serious about this right now. A part of why I think it's hard for people, and again, I also want to point out that the South are not red states. The demographics of the South do not represent that. The South are not red states. They've just been oppressed states. And the states with the largest Black population having the lowest Black turnout, those kind of coincidences.
Yeah.
Right. Those kind of correlations are not coincidences.
Right.
There's some causation there that I like to call oppression. Now,
literally, like I remember the first time I ever went to the Equal Justice Museum in Mississippi, where they have a memorial on lynching, and they organized these like big cylinders that hang from a ceiling. You walk around sort of in a circle, and they organize it by state and county. And I was like, holy shit, I've memorized these county names because it's where the largest concentration of people of color votes are. And the fact that that's where the largest concentration of violence was wielded in these counties is not, I mean, Terrance, you're right. Like,
not a question
for real. And I bet if we were to cross-reference those pillars in those counties where there was the most violence to those counties that were losing that you referenced at the top,
Yep.
I bet there'd be a lot of correlation.
There's a lot of correlation there, you know.
Yeah.
That's wild, Tory, that you're like, oh, I know these county names.
I know these counties. Yeah. All political
Crazy.
operatives who work in the South would recognize the county names on those pillars.
I mean, and when you look at it, you talk about how money is being spent. I think that's both a geographic and a demographic question, right? Where it's being spent and who it's being spent with, because 90% of Democratic spending is still going to white firms. I think that's why it's been so hard to reorient the map, because when you look at where the Black counties are concentrated, it's along the Southeast. When you look at where Hispanic counties are concentrated, it's along the Southwest. And that's also where all of the new electoral college and congressional votes are moving.
Right.
And so we better get serious about it.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you something real quick, because this relates directly to what the whole like past 5 minutes. But I know you have some research on the correlation between Black voters' perceptions of their vote power and turnout, and that seems really important to this particular conversation. I know we've got NYC hanging in the background here, but before we go to NYC, which is useless.
Yeah, right.
I don't know if it's useless. Maybe it's not.
There might be a tie-in because the
There might
question
be.
is an interesting one. So yeah.
Let's get back
All right,
to
we'll
it.
come back to New York City. We're gonna spend some time there.
No. Back to this perception. Yeah, the perception and the
Yes.
actual. Yeah.
So the most important question that HIT strategies ask on every single poll, if you've ever worked with HIT, we will ask this question. If you haven't worked with HIT, please call us. The most important question we will ask is, regardless of how often you vote, how much power does your vote have to make a difference in your community? The higher they rate those perceptions of power, the more likely they are to vote. It's a direct correlation. It sounds like common sense, but what it has done is reorient our messaging and our strategy away from, can we make you more likely to say you'll vote, or make you more likely to like Kamala Harris, to, can we make you understand the power of your vote? Because if you do, you won't waste it. And back to the South, we've typically seen perceptions of power range between 50 to 70% of Black folks saying that they believe their votes have a lot of power. Well, those perceptions are the highest in Georgia, where they have seen sustained investment, sustained engagement and communication. Those perceptions of power are the lowest in a place like Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama. Again, that is oppression, right? Perceptions of power, feeling like you do not have the power to make a difference, are oppressive tactics.
Right.
And one last thing I do want to say, though, is because in a place like Florida, we work with groups in Florida like Faith in Florida and others. And what we've discovered is, even when you don't have the political levers of power, harm reduction and pain prevention are perceptions of power. When you can prevent the government from doing harm to your community, that is also power. And I think that's an important lesson to learn from Florida, because that is the position that Democrats are in today.
I also think it's sort of the well, I guess we could go on a Florida thread for a minute, but I also feel like it was sort of the rationale for some of the vote consolidation around Biden in the primary when we were heading into the 2020 cycle, because and I feel like people are over extrapolating that, well, look at all these voters of color and Black voters, they're so conservative, they like people like Biden, instead of realizing, like, no, it was a strategic move to back the most establishment or most obvious player, just to ensure in that run, like, that we had the best shot. It wasn't like we all love him, like that kind of thing. I think people don't understand how strategic some of that early vote was.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, there were voters in that primary. I worked for Tom Steyer in 2020, who went all the way to South Carolina, so I was able to play in the first 4 primaries. For folks that don't know, that's one of the good billionaires. Gives all of his money to Progressive Caucus. We like him. But I do remember that there were several candidates in the race that had a higher favorability than Joe Biden. even though Black voters were preferred Joe Biden. Right. I think that goes directly to your point that it wasn't just who they liked the most. It was a strategic decision. I think that also contributes to what's happening in New York City.
I know, I was about to say, well, do we think so?
As we loop back around to that question.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so when you look at the polls in some of the polls in New York, we have seen Andrew Cuomo maintaining a pretty dominant lead, specifically with voters of color, specifically with Black voters, but also with legacy voters, with voters who had been in New York for more than 20 years. I think that tells you a couple of things. One is he is a legacy candidate who has not just name ID, but legacy familiarity to these voters, like Joe Biden had after being Barack Obama's vice president for 8 years.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I think is very similar to the strategic decision that Black voters are making in New York, just like they did when they chose Joe Biden to be the nominee, is that they see the number one adversary in Donald Trump, right? New York sees what's happening in LA, a city that is quite literally being invaded by the federal government.
Yeah.
You know, and we have seen in the polling that Black voters have expressed more concerns about the actions of ICE than any other voters in the country, more concerned than Hispanic voters.
Really?
Right. Black voters were more concerned about kids in cages than any voters in the country.
And that was kind of with our research too, Jen, that we did on the immigration enforcement a couple of weeks ago. Black voters caught it like that.
That's
I mean,
right.
It's very familiar.
Yeah, Black voters have lived it and they see what's happening. I mean, it comes through in every poll I've seen that Black voters get what's happening.
That's right.
And is your supposition then, Terrance, that that voters of color are like, we want someone who's a bully himself in some ways, who knows how to work the levers of power to help protect us? Is that why you think there's support for Cuomo in that sense?
Not start a war, right? Or something like, it seems like Trump, look, I tell this anecdote to everyone, so there's really no reason for me to keep my mouth shut on this podcast, but like when Harry Houdini went to a new city, he never spent a dime on advertising. He would find the newspaper office, do his best trick in front of the office, and then the paper covered it, and he had sold out sales for his whole tour. Donald Trump understands New York City is where you perform a trick so that the newspaper offices see you and the whole world sees it. Like there was a reason he went to Madison Square Garden at the end of the cycle last cycle. It wasn't because there's a ton of swing voters in New York. You know, like it's because it's the heart of where media gets distributed. Anyway, and so if you have like a young, progressive socialist running a city where the newspaper offices are still paying attention, Trump is going to go in and hammer that nail every single day. You would have to be like, Mondami would have to be ready for the performance of a lifetime to hold up to that scrutiny. It's scrutiny that Brandon is getting out in Chicago he is not being held up. I don't know. It's not like his polling is holding up. It's really challenging. And so I do think I can see the harm mitigation playing out in this scenario.
That's exactly what that is. Pain prevention, especially amongst Black voters, for sure. You know, they're picking their fighter. They're picking their pit bull against the other pit bull, you know? And I don't know if he would be as dominant with Black voters if Kamala Harris was president. If they did not have this clear and present threat, this existential threat hanging over the city, I don't know that he would be as dominant with Black voters right now.
It's interesting.
That is interesting.
Do you feel like that's an extrapolation? I mean, this is really early presidential speculation for 2028, but like, do you think that's a similar mentality? I mean, if Trump is still president and not king and still, you know, as belligerent as ever, as crazy as ever, do you imagine that it could play well for someone to be that type of fighter where you feel, I mean, because Biden wasn't that type of fighter. Biden was not,
Not.
obviously. So like
Didn't
Biden won.
embody it.
I feel like Biden won for different reasons in 2020 than what might be necessary for 2028.
But it was an electoral strategy and not a governing strategy.
Okay,
It was he can win.
that's fair. Yep,
Mhm.
he can win.
That's it. He can win. He can beat Trump. Our dog can beat their dog.
Yeah.
It wasn't a governing strategy.
Yeah.
Right.
True.
And it wasn't a long-term strategy. It wasn't a let's
No.
just keep the same dog in the same hunt over and
It was
over.
a crisis. It was a crisis decision.
That's right.
So this gets around to something too. It seemed like in our focus groups, and particularly Black men, like they did not feel the effects of Biden. It felt like they felt Biden's absence more than anything. And that came in our skipper focus groups, that tended to come across. People generally did not think that Biden had done anything, which is, we know not true. He had passed an incredible amount of legislation given what kind of, numbers he had to work with in Congress. But are people the people of color, young voters, and your perception feeling what's happening and responding to what's happening, what Trump is doing?
No, absolutely not. That was one of the more frustrating things about the 2020 to 2024 administration of Biden-Harris is just how much they were getting done. And how little credit they were getting for it. In fact, we did a poll with Black Future Labs in January of 2021, right after inauguration, and asked Black voters, what do you want to see the Biden-Harris administration prioritize? We gave them a list. We rank ordered it based on their preferences, and the Biden-Harris administration achieved 80% of it in one term, right? But almost 40% of Black men said that their lives had not gotten any better while Donald Trump was president. I'm sorry, while Joe Biden was president. So there was always that disconnect. I do think that Democrats are going to have to figure out how to market. I think that we see this Trump White House using tax dollars as marketing and advertising money on TV, buying ads, showing what they are doing. I think we're going to have to consider some of that next time we're in office. But also, according to a New York Times poll just 2 weeks ago, 48% of Americans say that nothing that Donald Trump has done has made their lives better or worse. That number doesn't concern me as much as the fact that 45% of Black voters feel the same way. And 53% of Hispanic voters feel the same way. And 53% of voters under the age of 40 feel the same way. If half of them don't think anything he is doing has hurt them, then we have a problem.
We have a big problem. We also have a credibility problem because we're running around saying like you said, Terrance, Project 2025, the sky is falling and everything's terrible. Oh my God, it's the end of democracy as we know it. And everybody's like, y'all, I'm still going to the soccer games. I'm still buying groceries at the same groceries I was able to afford before. Then it's like we have a credibility problem too. It worries me.
Because not only is it not getting that much worse for them, but they also do, and this is what I'm starting to hear more and more in focus groups, they just don't see Democratic leaders fighting against it, right? If they don't see our leaders defending democracy, then is it even worth defending? Is it even as bad as they're trying to convince us that it is?
Right.
And so that's, this is where we have to move from being the minority party to the opposition party. The opposition party takes action. Look, the minority party just, cast a minority vote on this budget. The opposition party puts out an alternative budget. The opposition party says, this is what we would be funding.
Right.
We would be funding childcare. We would be funding, and we have to fight to prevent the pain of the big, beautiful budget. We have to do both, but we can't just.
I think about that a lot. I think the most powerful Democrats right now, when you think about it, are the ones with governing purses, like the governors.
Yep.
the people right now who could be not just talking like a resistance talk, but actively modeling what does it look like to tax the very, very, very wealthy, right? And shift the wage floor and maybe like do something big and symbolic on a few fronts where like a few things get fixed, a few things get built, a few jobs are created, and just tell that story very quickly. Because otherwise, talk about that. I think that's how you fix the credibility issue. Then we're not just all Chicken Little telling everybody the sky's falling and symbolically, putting up a fight, but like actually showing what it could look like.
What? So you mean if we make their lives better?
Yes.
Then we could have a more effective message about how we made their lives better?
Yeah, like what is the point of being a governor with that big old purse if you're not doing something about it?
Those are the folks that I'm afraid, we talk a lot about the pain in the electorate. We don't talk enough about the anger, right? And we see a lot of that expressed in this like white rural, anxiety and anger. But Democratic voters, those cynics, they are not just in pain, they are angry, and it's punitive. They want to punish people, and the first people they want to punish are the Democrats that have been in charge. So that's the credibility correction, some of the credibility correction we have to do, because like a young man told me in my focus groups, my mama voted for Democrats, her mama voted for Democrats, her mama voted for Democrats, her mama voted for JFK, but my life is still like this. And so who deserves,
We heard that. We hear that a lot. And sometimes we hear Barack Obama was president. That was great. My life's still the same.
Yeah. My heart didn't get any better under Obama, and it didn't get any worse under Trump.
Jen, do you have a final question? Can I give you final question privileges?
I guess I'm kind of wondering about going forward. So I think it is really clear, like you say in the data, that Democratic voters across the board, all demographics, don't like Dems responding to Trump in this kind of weak way. They want to see real fight. They want to see a real standing up and being as visible as possible. So that seems like one important thing going forward. But what are the other sort of silver linings that you see? I mean, we know that all voters, across the coalition don't like what Trump is doing. When you ask them, right, they oppose things like the tariffs, they oppose the government spending cuts. We found in our polling around immigration, they're opposing the enforcement actions. They may approve of the policy right now, but they're definitely opposing how it's being enforced. So, and it makes me think, to wrap up all of what you've been saying, like there has to be a forward looking positive kind of vision, at the same time that it feels like we should be able to exploit the way that people don't like what Trump is doing, even though they're not feeling it. So I'm kind of like, how do you wrap that pretzel? Like, how do you have to try to get them to feel it personally? Like, what are your thoughts around how you kind of square that?
Yeah, look, I this might be an oversimplification, but I believe that the pain of Trump and the pain that he's causing, which we know voters do not feel yet, that is the campaign we have to launch for the next 18 months. That the pain that Trump is causing, that's the path to victory for 2026. The promise of what Democrats are offering, that has to be the path to victory in 2028 and beyond. Right. Yeah. I do think we could spend the next year just saying, have you gotten better or worse? Look at how he's hurt you. Right. After that, we're going to have to quickly go to, here is our vision. If Democrats were in charge, this is what the world would look like. And I've been, I'm a student of history. I've been listening and reading a lot of FDR, and to hear him talk about the world as he sees it, a world where you aren't poor because you get old. And you aren't homeless because you got sick. This is not our America can be different. Yeah. And now we're living in it. I think it's that kind of vision setting of what the world could be. That's going to have to be what carries us through 2028. But for now, the pain, he's causing enough pain. I think that can get us through 2026.
Gotcha. All right. So I have two potential titles for this. And for this episode, one is the opposition party takes action. All right. That was something Terrance said. I like that. And then it could be, or here's another one, the pain and the promise. Anyway, just throwing it out there. Just throwing it out there. We sometimes ask a bonus question.
That sounds like a book title to me.
The pain and the promise.
I love it.
This is something we asked you last time you were on. So I'm going to ask it again, but you can do repeats if you want. So 3 pieces of media, podcasts, TV shows, whatever that you are digging into.
Let's see. Obviously, the Way to Win pod, but also
yes.
I love Native Land Pod with Angela Rye, Tiffany Cross, and Andrew Gillum. I am, I'm doing this kind of like voluntary withdrawal from political media sometime. And so it's also like below deck. It's real mindless TV. Like
it really is.
That's real.
That's amazing.
I totally support that.
I just started the 2nd season of the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders.
Sounds great. I'm tuning in. That sounds great. I'm gonna follow a storyline. I can pick up at any episode at any time, cut it on, and just tune in.
So our thought leaders of today, and the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders, season 1, season 2. I don't know how many seasons there are, but sounds like 2, just 2 seasons. Oh, you're gonna have to come up with something new now. All right. Well, I think we're gonna leave it there. Thank you so much. I want to thank our special guest, of course, and inaugural friend of the pod, Terrance Woodbury. Love it. And
thank you all so much for having me.
That's great. And of course, Tory and Jenifer. My dog's going crazy. I don't know if you guys can hear it. Tory and Jenifer, thank you for joining the discussion about, how do we move forward? What happened? How do we move forward? This is what we ask basically in different forms every time we come on the pod. Thank you to our listeners for staying engaged in the work of rebuilding our democracy and making us here at Way to Win and our podcast relevant. Because without you guys, without our listeners, we are not relevant. So please, if you appreciate our work here, tell a friend, recruit a new listener so that you'll have someone to talk shop with while so many people are watching the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders and trying to disengage from politics altogether. With that, we will see you next Thursday. Until then, do good, be well, hug your loved ones, and tell your dog I say hi.
Ladies and gentlemen, leaders and fighters for freedom and liberty and the American dream, the